she told me that if I married him, that would be the equivalent of walking into the gas chamber of my own free will. That gives you an idea of how scary she could be. But she meant that out of love. And I think the lies and the love are very entangled here. And you say how angry was I? I was utterly furious after her death. I thought I knew her better than anybody else in the world, and it turned out I didn't know her at all.
All parents lie to their children, but some do more than others. For Monique Charlesworth, the lies her mum told growing up have pushed her to a policy of absolute honesty with her own children. She tells the story of her mother's deceit in pursuit of a new life after the horrors of the Holocaust in Mother Country. The book is out now, was published on Thursday, and Monique joins us in the studio. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
You always had a sense. Tell us what we're talking about here. Then you always had a sense your mum wasn't telling you her full story. But what did you discover? How did you discover it?
What was disconcerting was that I knew that she was fooling other people, and she was masquerading. She was living a kind of double life already, and she had never been able to tell anybody the fact that she was German, the fact that she was half Jewish, that she'd been a refugee. She spent her life concealing these things out of sadness and shame. And so at the end of her life, she was living in France and pretending to be English and giving English lessons to people who couldn't hear the German accent and avoiding English people who would immediately say, "Where are you from, Inga?" And so I knew, and as it were, colluded in all of that. And I would never tell her friends that she was German. They thought she was an English lady and she gave English lessons, which of course she was entirely unable to do. So when she died, and I then discovered that she had also fooled me, her trusted confidant, I was furious. And the main fury was because she had concealed a lifelong affair with a man she married when she was 60, and his family said that we were his children. That was a shock you don't want to have in your late 60s.
So do you understand the first part of that, the not wanting to talk about being half Jewish, not wanting to talk about what happened to her family in the Holocaust? Is that a different order of lying? Because that's kind of understandable. Who knows how you react to trauma? It's one of the most sort of traumatic possible experiences, all of that. Do you sort of have a league table of lies and their justification when you look back on your mum's life?
I think, that's a totally justifiable thing. She basically had to be somebody else in order to survive. And I think she didn't knowingly tell a lie. She really, it was more she didn't want to reveal herself. As children, we didn't know that she was German, couldn't hear the accent, didn't know that she was Jewish. There was no way that we would have ever discovered it if my sister hadn't by chance wormed it out of her. And at that point, the cat was out of the bag. And
when was that?
I was 11 when that happened. And she became more defensive as a result, and I think began to mistrust us. Her own children were then the enemy. So this is a very sad situation in which, as a survivor who would never use that word. She hated the expression Holocaust survivor. She refused to be a victim. She refused to be in any way damaged. So she sort of launched into being somebody else, which was quite funny and at times.
And did that extend to her love life then? Do you think that's because it's a symptom of the same issue, that desire to construct a different identity, a refusal to recognise that people close to you need to know who you really are? And because she's been doing it all her life, she couldn't almost see a moral distinction between the two.
Yes, you understand it really well. she starred in a drama of her own making, a sort of operatic drama. She'd fallen in love at the age of 13, never told us that, told us that she loved our father, who was a soldier she'd met during the war, living underground in Brussels. But actually, in her head, I think she was always, madly in love with this married man whom she couldn't have. And she threw herself into that kind of fantasy and often acted in a very operatic way, which for her children was very disconcerting.
And can you forgive her then? You've written this beautiful book about it. So you're wrestling with the issues. Where do you end up with this? Do you still have anger, or do you actually think you can become reconciled? Because it comes from a very difficult place at the origins, and who's to say how any of us would react in that situation?
The whole thing's quite tangled, but I spent my whole life, once I discovered who she was, trying to become Jewish, which I did. I converted, married my lovely husband, and becoming eventually German and got my citizenship. So my trajectory was the opposite of hers, and that was something that she hated.
And what did she make of your husband being Jewish?
She told me that if I married him, that would be the equivalent of walking into the gas chamber of my own free will. That gives you an idea of how scary she could be. But she meant that out of love. And I think the lies and the love are very entangled here. And you say how angry was I? I was utterly furious after her death. I thought I knew her better than anybody else in the world, and it turned out I didn't know her at all. And the book is, in a way, started as a howl of rage and grief and upset. How could she do that to me? I was her, supporter. I was her, number one on the team. But by the time I worked out why, and the research showed me who her father had been, where she'd come from, what had happened, in the end, when you understand, I think you forgive.
Yeah, that's a nice way of leaving it. Monique, really good to speak to you. It's a fascinating story. Thank you for joining us now.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's Monique Charlesworth there. And her book is called Mother Country, where she wrestles with love and lies and how the two might interrelate.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating story.